Dietitian Myrna Haag. You're on the Myrna Method live stream. So excited to have you here. My goal is to give you impactful nutrition information that can significantly impact your life. Because nutrition can do that. A lot of people don't know that. It can, not just about weight loss, but nutrition does everything for the body. So let's get started, Sam, because what we're going to talk about in this podcast is, if you can switch me over to, you got it? All right. We're going to talk about emotional weight gain. So I thought during the holiday season, it would be appropriate to talk about how the holidays can trigger overeating. So in the last session, the last podcast we talked about was how overeating caused addiction. So we had these holiday trigger foods, and we talked about how this can really cause us to overeat. We kind of get into this food addiction cycle, and that in itself can put weight on, because it's not just about, hey, I'm done eating, I feel full, my body has everything it needs. Why does the body keep eating? So food addiction is huge. I think we really covered it well. If you missed it, you might want to pick that one up. But what we're going to talk in this podcast is actually what happens without overeating when you gain weight. Now, this is really a big one, because it's about psychological issues that actually trigger weight gain. So this can lead to us gaining fat, and we're not necessarily overeating. And I think during the holidays, we find ourselves in that situation probably more than not, because during the holidays, it's a really emotional time. Let me see if I can remove, there we go. It's an emotional time, and with the holiday season, it brings all these stressors and emotion, like anxiety, loneliness for some people, maybe even excitement, anticipation, and all this can contribute to weight gain without overeating. These emotions can disrupt sleep, elevate cortisol levels, and disrupt the gut microbiome. All of this impacts our weight, our overall well-being, and this is going to happen pretty prevalently during the holidays. So let's talk about what are the main culprits. So what contributes to this emotional eating that can contribute to weight gain without necessarily overeating is anxiety and depression, lack of sleep, and gut bacteria. So these are things that you're not necessarily having it be because you've eaten more sugar or fat, which we talked in the last podcast, how that can trigger the brain chemicals and you just keep sitting on this addiction cycle. This is about actually physiologically, things that are emotionally troubling you can affect areas of your body that can contribute to weight gain. And so we're going to talk about the science behind it, because I always think that's super important. And we're going to talk about the cortisol levels, the gut bacteria, and the hormones insulin, ghrelin, and leptin. And all these hormones have these feedback loops that actually create more fat storage and hence more weight gain. So what we're going to talk about also is how to reverse it. And real simple, I want to tell you up front, it's about timing the protein and increasing the fiber. And I'm going to go through the science, why that's the case, so you can better understand the reasoning behind that. Exercise and why that's important. And then stress reduction. So to reverse it, we can do some things in our diet, and we can do some things in our lifestyle, that all of these emotional contributions to weight gain won't happen. So let's first go into the science. Super important. Let's understand why it happens. So first, let's talk about sleep deprivation. This produces two main hormones, ghrelin and leptin. Ghrelin triggers hunger, and this triggers less leptin. Leptin is the hormone that's made in fat cells that tells us to stop eating. It's more like one of the satiety hormones. And this triggers us to be more satisfied, more full. Well, when you have actually more ghrelin, you're going to have less leptin. So you're not going to feel as full when this hormone is raging in the bloodstream. And sleep increases the hormone ghrelin, which is made in the stomach. Now, this can also disrupt the metabolism, and this can affect the insulin, and it makes it even harder to burn calories. We're going to really talk about this. It's insulin resistance, which always makes it tougher to lose weight, but also it can lead to more fat storage, and sleep deprivation can lead to this. Also, a lack of sleep can increase your cortisol levels, which will release more sugar in the blood, and we're going to get all into that because this cortisol level ultimately affects the insulin level. And it's one big feedback loop, and it's all coming from sleep deprivation. So we'll talk about the hormones involved, how they work, and most importantly, how we can prevent it. So lack of sleep increases the hormone ghrelin, which triggers the hunger in the brain, and this actually wants the brain to have more sugar and fat, more reward foods. It hits those dopamine centers, the dopamine and the GABA, and this is basically in the brain, and we talked about that in the last podcast, how sugar and fat foods can do the same. Right? They can trigger these receptor sites in the brain that tells the brain, boy, we'd really love to have more sugar and fat because they just make us feel better. Well, lack of sleep can also trigger this hormonal imbalance. So losing sleep over the holidays triggers brain chemicals for more sugar. And not such a good environment to be in during the holidays because, as you know, we are literally having tons of sugar because that's what people feel is going to make you feel good during the holidays. You know the story. They bring you the brownies, the cookies, the pie. It's not like they're coming to see you and they're bringing you broccoli or a salad. And sometimes you'd wish, I wish I didn't have all that because it does trigger some of these addiction. What I'm saying here is besides having the sugar and fat, it can start with a lack of sleep that in itself can trigger this addiction. And then what happens when you increase this hormone in the stomach from hunger, and this can happen from a lack of sleep, you will actually decrease the hormone, which is it's a feedback loop, for leptin. This means that you'll be less able to know if you're satisfied because a lot of these cues come from hormones. So when we talk about weight reduction, which is what I talk about a lot in my program, is that it's about chemical imbalances. A lot of times people think, I'm just gaining weight because I don't exercise enough, or maybe I'm gaining weight because I just am not eating the right foods. Well, you're probably not eating the right foods because you have a trigger chemically that is making you want to have the wrong foods. So bottom line, understanding how it works chemically, I think is super important. And understanding it's not just food related, but it can also be emotionally related. So let's talk about the release of stress and how that hormone affects our insulin levels, our hunger, and how this in itself can cause an increase in fat storage. So when you have stress, and stress can happen from just, trying to get where you're going on time. You've got gifts you got to get for everybody. You've got maybe emotional stress with the family getting together. Maybe you have work deadlines you got to get in before the holidays because you got the new year turning over. But usually the holidays bring stress to the table. Even though it's a happy time, we also have some stressful times. Well, this stress releases a hormone cortisol. And this releases more sugar in the blood, which then releases more insulin. So let's walk through the biochemistry and show you how it all works. So when your body releases the cortisol, it's because when you get stressed, the body releases a hormone called cortisol. That cortisol tells the liver to dump more sugar in the blood. So what happens as soon as that cortisol hits, the body dumps more sugar in the blood, or I should say the liver, and this sugar is trying to get to the muscle. Now, why would the liver dump sugar in the blood? Because sugar's main goal, is to get inside muscle cells after you're covered in them so that you can move quickly from the stress because the body was built millions of years ago, and stress usually meant that you were going to be chased by a lion. You had to either fight or flight. So the body wanted to make sure your muscles had plenty of sugar to run away or fight against whatever it is you're stressing out over. Now, we know that we're not going to be running from anything millions of years later. Your stress can be paper stress, can be stress that doesn't really mean you got to run away or fight anything. It's more what psychological, emotional stress, but it doesn't matter. The liver is still going to dump sugar in the blood, thinking your muscles are still going to have to fight or flight. And so with this increase of sugar in the blood, what happens is we then get an increase of insulin. It's just the way it works. Insulin is released into the blood. I tell this story all the time. I think all my podcasts I tell this story because this is the biggest culprit for weight gain. And in this case, it's the biggest culprit for weight gain during emotional stress. So the insulin attaches to a receptor site that sits on the muscle cell. And as soon as that insulin attaches to the receptor site, it talks to a messenger who talks to another messenger with the goal of allowing the transporter to the surface of the cell. This not only happens in muscle cells, but it happens in brain cells. And what happens in the case of fat storage is the receptor sites become clogged with fats. Now, why would they become clogged with fats? Because maybe we're eating too much dietary fat, maybe we're just too doggone fat, but excess fatty acids that accumulate in muscle cells. And I think this is super important because a lot of people will look to diabetes as being a sugar problem. And granted, it is. I mean, sugar is a culprit, but the root cause is all these excess fatty acids. They accumulate in muscle cells, and they get up there and they just gunk up this receptor site along with certain immune cells like tumor necrosis factor. Some of these other cytokines are very inflammatory. So along with some of this, we have some inflammatory agents as well. Okay, we have reactive oxygen species, but for the most part, what triggers this is excess fatty acids that accumulate in muscle cells, which are not really designed. The key here is excess. Like I said, fats have their purpose, especially good fats, but it's when we're having too much of the release of these into the bloodstream. When that happens, unfortunately, the receptor doesn't get the message to the transporter. Glucose transporter number 4 never goes to the surface. So what tends to happen is that we get more sugar in the blood. So we got more stress. We didn't even eat more. And this is what's crazy. We didn't eat more, but we got more sugar in the blood because we got stressed out. The sugar never made it to the muscle, so you could run away from the stress. So as the sugar begins to accumulate, the body then releases more insulin. And as the body releases more insulin in the blood, you're going to get an increase in hunger. And to me, that's the first culprit, is that excess insulin increases hunger. Not the kind of hunger where you need food, because we do have signals when the body says, I really need food, okay? This real physiological hunger. But when it's psychological, when it comes from stress-induced, that actually causes this excess insulin, which then increases hunger, now we're going to talk about the fat storage problem from this. Keep in mind, you didn't even eat anything. This is from being stressed and how it can increase fat storage. So when the sugar is not successful at getting into the muscle because the receptor site is not allowing the message to let the transport come to the surface, then the sugar's got to go somewhere and it makes its way into fat cells. Because when sugar can't get into muscle cells, remember, muscles store sugar for a really good reason. Brain cells can also do the same. But when this isn't happening like it should, the body takes this sugar and begins to put it into the fat cell. And these sugars that go into these fat cells increase fat in the abdominal area. So you tend to get, a muffin top, a little thicker in the middle. And this is usually what we call insulin resistance, which then leads to type 2 diabetes, because that's what this is. But decades before they diagnose you as a diabetic, you're going to have insulin resistance. Where you're going to notice it is you're starting to get thicker in the midsection, and you're not necessarily eating that much more. But this is where a lot of stress can increase fat storage, can increase body weight, and you're not necessarily bringing in more calories. We see it with a lot of people, they're starting a job and they're just seem to be getting, I guess, more of that apple shape. They're just big round in the middle. And we'll see that with a lot of executives, real important positions. We're going to see that big barreled area in the belly. And this definitely has to do with stress. So the key here is cortisol was because you got stressed, which then triggered the release of sugar from the liver, which then released the insulin, which right away made you hungry. And then because possibly you have some insulin resistance because nobody's taught you how to eat or how to manage these macronutrients, which is what I do. And I can show you how to do that in my course, which we'll get to at the end of this podcast. But bottom line, this increased the fat storage. So this is a perfect example how you didn't even eat anything, but you made yourself fatter. And that is a perfect example how cortisol and insulin gets triggered in the stress response. So let's see where I am here. There we go. So the next thing we want to talk about is the bacteria in the gut. And this doesn't necessarily have to do with food. Now, in the last podcast, we did talk about when you eat the wrong foods, you create more bad bacteria. And I did talk about a high-fat diet can increase bad bacteria. This can travel to the brain, these bad bacteria, and they can decrease your desire for food. So it was really clear in the last podcast when I talked about how foods can trigger this weight gain. So I wanted to still bring that into the equation. And I want to go back to saying why understanding how to eat macronutrients and understanding that your diet does have a certain way of eating protein, fiber, carbs, and fat, and too much excess fats can lead to diabetes. I'm not saying that you want to have no fat. I'm not saying you want a low-fat diet. I'm saying you want the right percentage, which is anywhere from 25 to 35% of your daily calories. And in the typical American diet, it's probably sitting more like 40 to 50% or even more with people that are just thinking they can have as much avocados, olive oil, and nuts as they please. Although these are good fats, it can be a problem. And it can also be a problem in the gut. These high-fat diets can protect the bad bacteria. And then these bad bacteria are not able to get killed by the good bacteria. And that's the biggest thing with diet. There's the whole thing with nutrition, it's all about feedback loops. Everything has a yin or a yang. And understanding how they work is super important. So with a high fiber diet, increases the good bacteria, and this can actually create some of that balance with the bad bacteria, because the good bacteria actually can kill the bad ones and keep that gut from having all this IBS and all these problems. Because let me tell you something. When I see somebody with anxiety, which we're going to go to next, I see them with gut issues. And this is where now we're going to talk about how depression and anxiety can actually affect the gut. So this is a perfect example how when we're talking about the gut affecting the brain with bringing in some of these bad bacteria, these chemicals in the brain can affect the gut. So anxiety and depression go both ways. It's biodirectional. So you can have a lot of anxiety and depression and you're going to have gut issues. I have never had a patient that didn't have gut issues with anxiety or depression. They go together because this affects the relationship of the gut microbiome. Also, eating bad food affects the relationship of anxiety and depression with the brain. So this is so intertwined. And what I'm trying to explain in this podcast, again, are things that can happen emotionally that aren't even related to food that can affect weight gain. Because when you have a lot of anxiety and depression, you can have a lot of weight gain. And I'm not just talking about weight gain because you're depressed and food makes you feel good. There's actually a chemical background to this. And I think the gut bacteria is one of them. Because when you start affecting these brain chemicals with these bad bacterias, they start affecting the reward center in the brain, the hypothalamus, the appetite center, and your body craves more of the type of foods that keep the bad bacteria alive in the gut, because these guys want to stay alive. They're little organisms. They're like little animals in themselves, and they don't want to die, and they don't want you to make them better because they want to flourish, as weird as that sounds. So I think that's like, in a way, kind of super spooky, right? Because we don't even think about how the brain and our anxiety can have effect on our gut and can actually affect weight gain. So let's talk about some studies. I'm going to go back and review it again. I know it's a ton of information, but I want to make sure you guys really understand how this all works, and especially how this works for you in regards to being able to prevent this weight gain from these psychological stressors. So I'm just going to look at some studies. I always like to bring studies to the table because, it kind of brings a little credibility. But in this study, it talks about how this gut microbiota, right, which is the gut bacteria, has a lot to do with this brain interconnections, this biodirectional relationship, this gut-brain axis. And this has evidence that links anxiety and depression disorders to the disorder of the community of microbes, which means that more of this anxiety and depression actually leads to more microbes that are these bad bacteria. And it's that loop, that consistent feedback loop, where you have more anxiety, depression, you have more bad bacteria, which then contributes to more anxiety and depression. So this is all related to the gut, and psychologically, not necessarily with food. Also, these gut bacterias, which I think is interesting, it can affect your palate, okay, your appetite, where you eventually, it changes the kind of foods you want to eat. And what I find, it's really interesting, because I know with a lot of patients, like with my finicky eaters, a lot of times they'll be like, well, I just don't like vegetables, or I don't like to eat this. And I always ask the question, well, do you usually eat that? And it's always no. Well, you have to develop your gut to want to eat these foods. And I did talk about this a little bit in the last podcast, but you almost have to train your body. You have to teach your body on the way you want it to go, especially with gut bacteria, because those gut bacteria will train your body in another direction to go. Because like I said, they're little organelles, or they're like little microorganisms that sort of have a little mind of their own. They can also turn on the hedonic form of eating, which means the pleasure mode in the brain. They turn on those dopamine centers, which we again talked in the last podcast, how foods can do that. Well, gut bacteria can as well. And the anxiety linked with that means that you're more prone to want to eat these foods when you have the anxiety and depression, more prone for gut bacteria and gut dysbiosis issues. Also, let's talk about sleep. So this study talks about the effect of acute sleep loss on leptin and ghrelin, adiponectin. These are all hormones that are related to appetite and satiety. And the key here, if you read in the highlighted area, it talks about how acute sleep deprivation reduces blood concentrations of the satiety hormones, leptin, with increased blood concentrations of ghrelin and adiponectin. So these all work in that endocrine system, this whole hormonal system, and it can actually facilitate weight gain. And that's without even bringing food into the equation, just lack of sleep. So the other thing I talk about is, and we did a whole explanation of this, is how diabetes is increased with stress. And why is that? Because it triggers the release of sugar from the liver, which then triggers the insulin release. And then if you have diabetes, you're not getting sugar into the muscle cell. Big problem. And what happens is it's going into the fat cells. That's why diabetics, they tend to gain weight. Listen, you give a diabetic more medication for diabetes, and I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. They're going to gain weight. It's just natural. Because especially if it's insulin, it really does promote weight gain. Now, my biggest pet peeve is that everybody's trying to fix diabetes by having you reduce the carbs. And I'm telling you, it's not the root cause of the disease. I'm not saying sugar doesn't contribute to it, but you have to learn how to eat. This is really what I'm all about, is teaching you a lot of things that people are telling you are to reverse symptoms. A lot of times medications do that. Ozempic does that, right? Why not just figure out impactful information that can change your life, and you can actually live your life at your leanest and healthiest by understanding nutrition and how it works. So in perspective to diabetes, I think the biggest thing here is to understand, first it starts with insulin resistance, which can lead to diabetes, but also the abnormalities that happen from the stress hormones that can trigger this and can trigger the fat storage. So hopefully the science is something you guys can totally get and understand. But let's talk about the review, and let's most importantly talk about how we're going to fix it. So what we talked about was sleep deprivation, how it increases hunger. It's actually a hormonal hit. We have ghrelin, leptin, adiponectin. I didn't mention the adiponectin, but it is there. These are all hormonal triggers that increase hunger. Now, remember, you can be hungry without really actually needing food. Ideally, the body should just be hungry because you need nutrients. But the body can be hungry for other chemical reasons. They can trigger this. That's what I'm trying to get at with some of the nutrition information I bring you. Because if we can reduce these addictions, if we can reduce some of these triggers, well then weight gain isn't going to happen. You're going to be able to maintain your ideal body weight much easier. The other trigger is emotional anxiety, and that's going to trigger that cortisol and that insulin, because the cortisol happens with stress, which triggers the liver to release the sugar, which triggers the insulin, which triggers more fat storage. And then also the bad gut bacteria. So a lot of anxiety and depression is biodirectional. That brain can destroy that little gut microbiome, and those can also biodirectional go back into the brain and affect your appetite. So gut bacteria, creating a lot of these bad gut bacteria, can actually affect your brain chemicals. So the key is understanding that it's not just about eating sugar and fat that can cause weight gain. It's also some of these other issues emotionally that we possibly don't understand how that works. But most importantly, let's get right down to how do we fix it. So the key in fixing it, which I'm going to go back to the science so you can see how this works, is we need to time the protein and increase fiber. So when you're under stress, the last thing you need is more sugar in the blood. Let's all agree on that. But it's not like you can just not have carbs at all, because I do talk about carbs are important because muscles want them. But when you're under a stress situation, the last thing to do is go for the stressor foods that your body's trying to relieve you with more sugar. You're hungry? Then try to do protein and fiber, because it's not going to trigger more sugar release, because that's the last thing you need when you're under stress. So we want to reduce the hunger with the protein and fiber, and we want to control the blood sugar. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to give you some reference with that. Also, fiber, gut health, super important, because we know a lot of these plant foods are going to increase these good fibers or good bacteria from these fiber fermentation. So the big tip is knowing how to eat your protein and fibers when you're in the stress, when you have sleep deprivation, when this is all happening emotionally, to reduce the weight gain from the hormonal triggers. So let's go back and talk about it so we can better understand it chemically. So obviously, when you are having stress, your body is, let me see if I can erase some of this and we can make this thing work. So when you're under stress, your body's releasing the cortisol, your cortisol's releasing the insulin. So the last thing you want to do, and by the way, when you release insulin, you have more craving for sugar. You're also hungrier. You really feel hungrier, even though you may not have a real need for more nutrients. So the best thing you want to do is you want to bring in some protein and fiber. I'm not saying don't eat. I'm saying let's try foods that have some protein and fiber. We don't even need a lot. It's just enough to sort of curb the chemical that's going on in your blood. The last thing you want to do is give in to more carbs, because as soon as you eat more carbs, you're going to have this cycle really roll, and then you're going to be exhausted. Because when you increase a lot of this insulin, the other thing that happens that I don't mention here is after you get the increase in hunger and the increase in fat storage, then you get the loss in energy. It happens like 2 or 3 hours later. We all know that. We go through a sugar binge. You know what I'm talking about. You are just really tired after that. So this is all chemical. So by bringing in the protein and fiber, you can actually negate some of the insulin releasing into the bloodstream. And that's super important because you're hungry. You know that you don't want to, you're going to have that hormone ghrelin circulating, which means you're going to have a little bit of hunger. So bringing in the protein and fiber, when I say time release, because I'm saying, yes, bring the protein in. So if you're sleepy, the last thing, I know we all can have nights that we don't sleep. Maybe you're worried about something. You got to get up the next day and do your day. So you really want to be more conscious of carbs because you're tired and you're going to be releasing more sugar in the blood. So I say you want to be conscious that day that you've lacked sleep to try to do a little more protein and fiber. Just be more aware of your carbs. If you eat carbs, just make sure they have a lot of fiber. You're bringing protein into the equation. Because if you don't do that and you have a lack of sleep and you do bring in the carbs, everybody's been there, you're tired. You're more tired than normal. I know you didn't sleep the night before, but as soon as you ate that carb meal, you literally got to go to sleep. And so I think that's super important and to understand how that works chemically. And then fiber, of obviously increasing the fiber. So protein actually will release into the bloodstream and it will have an effect on the insulin. It will lower that. And fiber never leaves the intestinal tract. And this is very nice because it helps increase the good bacteria. If you do eat more food, it slows down the process. So going back to how to fix it, protein and fiber is the key, and timing it with that stress. Okay, the other thing, we got to reduce stress. And this means we got to get the cortisol levels down. So that means mental conditioning. I think support. I think having a community support, whether it's a therapist or whether it's a friend, but being able to talk through some of the things that are your stressors, and also meditation. So, maybe bringing some techniques into your life that kind of help you reduce the cortisol levels. And then exercise. So the thing about exercise, and I'll go back to my example, is that exercise can actually reduce stress chemically, but it also moves the sugar into the muscles and not fat cells. So let's go back to the example and show you. When you're stressed out and your body is releasing the sugar into the blood, so the liver is thinking you're going to run from a tiger because it's releasing the sugar in the blood and it's hoping it gets to the muscle. Well, one thing I didn't give you, information, that greatly impacts how to reduce the fat storage, because remember, the muscle wants to store the sugar, not the fat cell. Every time you exercise, insulin is not required to move the transporter to the surface. So when you exercise, the beautiful thing is that this transporter, let's see if I get my computer. Okay, Sammy, my computer's not allowing me to move the transport. Okay, there it is. Okay, so as soon as you exercise, the transporter comes to the surface of the muscle cell, regardless of insulin. So you could have insulin attached to this receptor site and it's not having any luck talking to the messengers. When you exercise, you don't need to have insulin. This comes right to the surface. Why is that a good thing? Because then the sugar is going to move into the muscle cell. So actually with exercise, you can reduce the fat accumulation into the fat cells because you're going to be moving sugar into the muscle cells because insulin isn't required and the sugar molecules will be able to go, the glucose will be able to go into the muscle, and when it's in the muscle, it's not in the fat cell. So when you're stressed because the body wanted you to go run, the best thing to do is if you have a stressful situation is try to incorporate exercise for the day, because that helps move the sugars where the body intended them to go in the first place. So how do we fix it? We bring in that protein, time it appropriately with our stress. We want to increase our fibers. We want to try to reduce the stress by doing some conditioning for yourself, understanding the things, the mechanisms that can help do that. And exercise will help move the sugars into the muscle instead of into the fat cells, where they should have been in the first place, is in the muscle. Especially if you're diabetic, especially if you have insulin resistance, this is a huge, huge component for reducing fat accumulation from all the psychological stress or even emotional stress that you might be experiencing for the holidays. So hopefully we covered everything. I will leave it open in the chat for any questions. You can always go to Myrna Method and you can get into my membership program. I do live streams just on how to eat. I know a lot of things I do on YouTube is to give you impactful information in nutrition. But most importantly, I want to teach you how the macronutrients work, how to eat. My program has videos where I basically talk about all that. And also we have, I'm going to see if do we have a little coupon, Samantha, or is that, okay, hold on a minute. There we go. I've got to find the right slide. So you can go in and get a 25% discount into my membership. All you have to do is put in the code HOLIDAY. And it's active through December 31st. And then the first of the year, we'll probably have some other great stuff for you. So let's leave the chat open and let's get some questions. And I'll let Sam do that.
I don't think we have any questions.
Okay, happy holidays. Thank you. Happy holidays to you guys. I appreciate that. So no other questions, Sam?
Not that I can see, but just remember
Okay.
to like and subscribe.
Right. We so appreciate, I do, Sam does, I especially do. I appreciate you guys. Thank you so much for your time. Give me feedback. Let me know if I'm really hitting the spot for you. Thank you for all the subscribers. Super, super appreciate it. Until next week, we'll still be on to the holiday weight gain. And then we'll be starting the new year. We won't have a podcast because Christmas and New Year will fall on our nights. But then right after that, we're going to go heavy duty into some really good topics for the first of the year. So until next week, awesome. Thank you so much. I will see you next time.